Welcome back to the channel, and today we are going to talk about bolt action basics. We're going to look at the minimum requirements of a platoon and what we need when we are constructing those together. These requirements apply to a generic reinforced platoon, any theater selectors you may have, and any army that you're constructing. We're going to look at a broad stroke, so hopefully this can apply to any army that you're looking at constructing. In front of us today we have the Germans, which most people are going to either have an army of Germans or going to be playing against Germans pretty consistently. So we'll be able to see this in action on the tabletop pretty regularly, and it should hopefully be familiar to you. If not, we're going to get very familiar with it so that when we go to build our own armies, we know what we're looking at and we have a good place to start. So in front of us here, we have our lieutenant. And our lieutenant is going to be our little guy in the middle here with his hand out pointing around. And next to him is an assistant. And on the other side is another assistant. And so they just make out the maximum number of members you can have in your lieutenant squad. And the lieutenant squad is just that dice unit count, whatever you want to call it there, that comes as a section or a unit in this example. So that's one of the things we have to take. The other two are going to be right behind him here. We have two infantry squads. These two infantry squads are just filled out generically right now. We can talk more about them in a moment. So let's come back to the lieutenant here. The lieutenant in of himself is very important because he's like your big commander guy. He can give buffs, he can do a snap 2 action, and in all of these things, he has the ability to kind of command your army. It's not super important on the battlefield, but when we look at how we're going to fit out his unit, one thing we need to consider is what role do we want him to play on the battlefield? And today, as we look at his unit composition and kind of what he can take, we need to remember that we can lose our lieutenant and still win the battle. You don't automatically lose the battle if you lose your lieutenant. And so there's two main ways that I've seen lieutenants be used, but I'm going to kind of throw a third one in there kind of with our different army composition. So starting off, we're going to look at this 3-man squad army lieutenant. Now, I've never run a 3-man squad army lieutenant. I know some people who do, but the main distractor for me on this one is you get 1 extra shot typically, or 2 depending on what you run with them, and you really don't get that big of a bonus because he goes from being a small squad to a normal sized squad. And so he's able to get hit a little bit easier, and it's just not really worth it in my opinion. Those 10 or 13 points are better spent elsewhere. And so if we look at this 3-man squad, this is one way of running him. I much prefer to run 2-man squads because you get that small squad bonus. And typically when I run a 2-man squad, I'm usually just sticking him in right behind some infantry so I can get kind of some big pushing and movement going forward. Maybe he'll be behind some infantry that I plan on kind of sticking up there, and they're going to probably take a couple pins, a couple casualties. And I just want my lieutenant there to give them that extra morale boost so they have that extra chance of activating. And the last way you can run a lieutenant is all by himself. And this way of running a lieutenant, in my opinion, is very viable if you're going to use him solely as an activation die or solely as a way of getting things to activate. So if you're going to hide him in somewhere, if you're not going to use him to assault, if you're not going to use him to take major shots, and he's just going to be parked behind units the whole time, having him behind other units is a great way of getting the most out of your lieutenant. So let's talk real quickly. I'm going to move some of these guys up to the camera a little bit here. If you look at this little guy here, he's wearing glasses and he's got a pistol. So that's something to note. Our other lieutenant guy, he's got what looks to be some type of machine pistol. And in the games would be run as a submachine gun. And our last guy has his little MP40 slung around his neck, and he's ready to go. So the reason I point this out is you can run, get these recentered here, you can run your lieutenant squad, kit it out any way you want to. They cost the same amount of points. And so the next consideration for your lieutenant is how are you going to use them? Now, I like to go a little bit more historical when I build my lieutenant squads, when I build my squads out, and I like the historical accuracy of having a lieutenant kitted out with a submachine gun or a pistol. And typically, when I run them in games, I just say, okay, here's my lieutenants. They've got submachine guns, and I usually keep them in the back. And occasionally, I'll use them for a last-ditch effort for like a close combat assault, or maybe I'll use them for a couple extra pop shots at a squad that is advancing at me. They're not typically used a whole lot for long-range shots. Now, I know of some people who run their lieutenant, but they'll run them with rifles because they like taking that longer range shot. You get that 24 inches, so you get a little bit more range so you can take some pop shots with your lieutenant with. And that's very viable. That's a good way of using your lieutenant. So it comes down to two train of thoughts when you're building your list, when you're building your lieutenant. It really, in my opinion, do you want historical accuracy with your lieutenant? So you might run a 3-man squad with pistols, might put a radio on one guy just for aesthetics, and they're going to be running around the battlefield, hoping to get some morale boost, hoping to get some pin modifiers, not going to do a whole lot of kills, but they've got the right equipment. Or are you going for the best unit availability? Are you going to kit them out with rifles, take those long shots? Or if you're someone like the Germans, are you going to give them assault rifles? The most bang for their bucks. You got that 18 inches of range. It really depends on what your mentality is when you come down to it. So it's up to you. The 3 ways I should say, that I see them run. You get your 3-man, 3 shots with rifles. Circle accuracy, you can go again, like I said, with the all submachine guns or pistols. The way I run them typically is 2 men with submachine guns. There's being bosses. And the last way, you do your single officer. He's there solely for that morale boost, solely for those modifiers, solely so that he can be that last-ditch effort for modifiers and really just doing what he needs to do. So that's lieutenants. I don't really want to stick on them too long, but they're super important because every army has to have a lieutenant, as well as every army has to have 2 infantry squads. So I've got 2 squads laid out here. We're going to look at one of them and kind of mess around with them a little bit. So the base of an infantry squad, typically, if you just look at a regular infantry on any army, you're going to have an option of taking an NCO and 4 of your infantrymen. So with 4 infantrymen and your NCO, this is going to be the start basis of your squads. And then you have options of adding things on top of that, in addition to that. And you can kind of kit out some stuff with this as well. So this is where you start getting in that strategy of, do I want to run these guys as a rifle squad? Do I want to run them as an LMG squad and bring in an LMG on that? Do I want to run these guys with 10 men and run them at full strength? There's a lot of things to consider, but know that you start off with your 4-man squad, and as you kind of figure out how you want to run your army, you can start to re-kit those out. My recommendation for your first game of bolt action, go with a 10-man squad, go with a light machine gun in that squad, and the rest of them have rifles. You can even have your NCO with a rifle if you want to. Again, I like running a little bit more historical accuracy, so I've got my NCO with a submachine gun. And that was very typical for World War II. Your NCO would have a submachine gun. Some armies had their NCOs with pistols. If you start looking at more of your historical documents of what actual people ran in the time, you had a lot of NCOs, you had a lot of commanders, a lot of lieutenants, stuff like that. They usually had pistols. And it was very rare to see a full platoon kitted out to what was specs. And so when you look at pictures from World War II and stuff like that, or captured documents from like what was captured on officers and stuff, you'll see a lot of them didn't have the MP40s or the submachine guns in more generic terms of what they needed to have. Instead, they would have just their old rifles they were issued, or they'd have a pistol, or maybe they actually had a captured enemy's gun. It all kind of depended on what they were able to get their hands on. And so when we look at that and we consider what it is that we are able to have in our normal infantry squads, and just your base infantry squads are going to look very similar to this. And I wouldn't put too much stress on what is an accurate bolt action list, what is not an accurate bolt action list. If you really wanted to get into the nitty gritty on what was historically accurate and what wasn't, you could really look at those lists, and I can give you a few of the lists and resources I have found if you guys are interested. But if you're just building your list, you need these three elements. You need your lieutenant, you need 2 infantry squads, and if you've got that, you've got enough to play a game of bolt action. And this right here, you've got in front of you here, kind of, I'll zoom out a little bit. In front of you here, you've got your basis of what you have to have. And if you can get this together, a little bit of terrain, I think this is a great way to play your first game of bolt action. You get your bare minimum, which is your lieutenant, your 2 infantry squads, and you can even drop this guy and just run it the way I like doing it. Two guys. So you got 22 men or 23 men, however you want to run it. 3 order die, running around capturing points. You can play on a 4x4 foot table or your kitchen table, just mark off the edges. Give it a shot. It's a ton of fun. You can build this out easily with a box that you get from a store with like 30 men in it. If you guys want, I can go into a breakdown of that as well later on in another video. But right now, I just wanted to give you guys a primer, a starter on what you need when you build a bolt action army. Your lieutenant, 2 infantry squads, what those squads will kind of look like, what I run them as. Typically, I do the more historical accurate with the Germans at least, and I usually do, your 1 light machine gunner, a bunch of riflemen, your NCO with the submachine gun. But if you look at your list, you don't need to run them that way. You can have your NCO with a rifle, which is probably better for the game. You could do a very heavy assault squad. It would have to be veterans, but you could run them with all submachine guns. And so you have options. They're in there in the very list forms. If you got questions about that, let me know. I'll try to answer them to the best of my abilities. But this is just a primer on getting the understanding of what the bare minimum for a bolt action platoon is. Thank you guys for your time. If you are liking this content, do me a favor and like and subscribe. If you've got questions, please comment them below. I will do my best to answer those to the best of my ability. And that's all I've got for you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for watching, and have a blessed day.